Total War Pharaoh released to very mediocre reviews, with everybody in the community being a little bit disappointed, but through some hard work, effort, and a little bit of luck, Creative Assembly completely turned this around, and it is now a fantastically polished experience. Or is it? Well, we're going to be going ahead and taking a look at answering that question here today in this video. Go ahead and make sure to hit the like button and subscribe to the channel if you like no-nonsense game reviews like I have been doing recently. In this video, I'm going to break down the goods, the bads, and a little bit of the ugly, and we're going to summarize it with a SWAS meter, which of course stands for story, world, action, sound, and style. So we're going to be hitting on what I categorize as the 5 most important points of any single game out there. We're going to be breaking it down, how this game scores on each and every one of these, and then giving it an overall rating on if you should buy it or not. So Total War Pharaoh is the latest historical entry in the Total War franchise. So there has been a little bit of a break from the Total War franchise with the releases of things like Warhammer and the DLCs associated with that. So this is kind of a return to the old Total Wars that we know, the historically based Total Wars. Let's go ahead and hop straight into it with the positives. There are, of course, going to be a lot of positives to talk about with this particular Total War title, the most notable of which is going to be the new resource system. So if you played the older Total War games, you'd know that most of the economy is based strictly around gold, and everything that you do in the game, every building that you build, every new zone that you conquer is going to result in your gold coffers getting a little bit more each turn so that you can recruit more troops, have more upkeep, the ceiling on your upkeep, as well as building more buildings, expanding your castles, all that sort of good stuff. Well, it is completely redone inside Total War Pharaoh, and it is absolutely fantastic. So, what did they do? Well, unit recruitment and upkeep, as well as general recruitment, are based around your food stores. To construct buildings, you're going to need things like stone and lumber, as well as potentially bronze for unit upkeep. So this means that trade is actually a very large part of any sort of diplomatic relations now, because early on in the game, for example, I started as Babylon, and I didn't have any sort of stone that I could use to upgrade buildings. So it was really hard to try and get any stone built up to, expand castles, build new buildings, and just, improve my infrastructure. So I was left with either a choice of doing a lot of diplomacy to try and secure new trades for stone. So, perhaps focusing on making food myself, exporting that, and then getting stone in return. Or I could essentially just focus on conquering new lands, some of which did in fact focus on producing stone. And this was the route that I chose, which it's fantastic, right? So it adds such a level of strategy to the game where you have to worry about the certain resources as opposed to just, oh, I have enough gold, I'm perfectly fine. And trade routes, and more so just trade specifically with the factions, because there's not really trade routes in this game per se, so you can't have like rated trade routes or anything like that like you'd get in the older games like Shogun and Empire. You just straight up trade and it's like uninterruptible, but the actual trade with other factions feels extremely satisfying as well as extremely important, which is super well done. Now, on to the next positive that I experienced was the Pillars of Civilization. This is essentially just kind of dynamic faction interactions. So the Pillars of Civilization mechanic essentially exists so that if other factions outside your borders are having a really tough time, it's going to start to spill over into your civilization as well. This means that it does actually kind of matter what's happening with other factions. So if you just sit there and let everybody go to war with each other, you're probably going to end up having a pretty tough playthrough. Some of these disasters or negative effects from the Pillars of Civilization can result in new invasions of super aggressive enemies that can come at really any point in the game, depending on how things are progressing, with sometimes full stacks of armies that you'll now have to deal with, and they'll randomly invade and sack your villages and all that sort of enjoyable stuff. On to the next part though, which is the unique historical time period. So this is obviously the very first game in the Total War franchise that has been set in the predominantly like Egypt, Mesopotamia area, right? So we've had other games that kind of include some of that area. So for example, like Medieval, but it wasn't to this extent. So you're going to have factions like, the Trojans, the Aegeans, the Babylonians, all that sort of good stuff, right? So a lot of stuff that people will know about from history class, but you may not be the most versed in. You can now explore that and, you know, essentially kind of live in that time period through the game, right? So you can kind of see how different factions interact. You can start to explore a little bit more like the locations and all those sorts of good things, which is very, very cool. It's nice to see them kind of expanding into new time periods throughout history. And it's really just a fascinating era, in my opinion, that's not really ever explored inside games. So it's very fresh, right? Especially when you, again, can compare it to those older Total War titles like Rome or Greece or just like medieval Europe, right? Which is very, very covered in gaming, especially in the older Total War games. So it's very nice to see some new options out there. Now, there's also a law-making system which just offers sensational customization to your campaign, in my opinion. So you essentially have points that you acquire from doing your interactions with inside the court, or, you know, just by doing other various tasks inside the game. And those points you can essentially invest to increase your law-making system's rank, if you want to think of it that way. There's, you know, special terminology for all this in the game, of course, but I mean, I'm here to kind of let you know if the game is worth it. I'm not here to give you a breakdown, a tutorial on the game. So I'm going to use terminology everybody can understand, whether you've played it or not. But when you increase the rank of your lawmaking system, it gives you options for higher ranking laws, more beneficial effects, and those sorts of things. So the way it works is with any particular law, you can have 3 effects attached to it. They can all be positive, they can all be negative, whatever you want, but it is a balancing act because, first of all, the positive effects are going to have longer durations for how many turns it's going to take for the law to actually go into effect. And especially if you're progressing pretty quickly through the game, if you've done all just maxed out positive effects, that law may not even be all that relevant by the time it's finished. So more often than not, you have to balance it out with a couple of negative effects in there, and they can be very simplistic things like extra XP for your bowman after a battle, or they can be a little bit more in-depth, like an extra 20% resources when you're in a raiding stance with your army, or things like, for example, extra resource production from certain buildings. Now, conversely, with the negative effects, they can be basic or they can be pretty advanced as well. So you can have things like, obviously, you know, just decreased production from buildings. You can have like decreased melee defense for certain units, and you get to pick and choose which units are affected, how they're affected, which resources are affected, how they're affected, and it is so fantastic. It adds a lot of, like I said, customization to the campaign. It really helps you feel like you're able to do things that just impact your faction at a wider level, as opposed to just depending on the research system, which is still inside this game, but this is kind of like an adjacent part, which is fantastic. And finally, for the positives, we have the cooperative campaign. So this has made a return, of course. A lot of the older Total War games do not have co-op campaigns, which people do actually like. I like playing them myself. So this lets you play with friends, right? Without that just intense PvP pressure. So it also helps to expand replayability for players who may enjoy the more cooperative strategy, right? Because Total War single player, at the end of the day, is only so fun, right? Once you've played all the factions, once you've experienced what the game has to offer, that's pretty much it. But if you're doing either a cooperative campaign, or if you're doing like maybe a head-to-head campaign, it adds so much replayability to the game. It makes it more of a social experience as opposed to just, you know, sitting there playing Total War. So it gives you options depending on what you want from your experience. Now, all that being said, let's go ahead and talk about some of the negatives. Now, I'm going to be honest straight off the hop with the negatives. This was probably the most bug-ridden, technically challenging review I've had to put out so far. So that is going to take up a lot of the negatives, unfortunately. So first of all, there is technical problems. I experienced a lot of crashing to desktops with this. So within the first hour, I already had multiple crashes. There was also auto minimizing, which happens, and this is a known issue. You can Google it. People still know about this. Creative Assembly knows about this. It has not been fixed. Essentially, you cannot run the game in full screen. If you run the game in full screen, it's going to minimize itself every single time a loading screen completes. So if you're trying to load into a battle, minimized. If you're trying to load your campaign, minimized. If you're loading back into the campaign map, After you're leaving a battle, it's minimized. And it's a simple Alt-Tab to fix the issue, but it gets very, very annoying, especially for a game that has released in the modern day. It's very demotivating to see this kind of a bug. It is something, like I said, of course, that can be fixed by just running the game in borderless, but I mean, realistically, we shouldn't have to. Now let's go ahead and talk about the achievements, which are also very, very poorly designed. Now, I forgot to mention this at the top of the video, but there's a couple of caveats with my review. So my experience is within the Dynasties portion of the game specifically, which is essentially the free DLC Redux that Creative Assembly released for the game because the initial launch was so rough. So it's going to be from that perspective, and it's also going to be from the perspective of the Babylon faction. So I didn't have a chance to play through many of the other factions, but I played through pretty extensively through the Babylonian campaign and had a lot of experience with that. So that being said, the achievements, very poorly designed. They're way too niche, they're too grindy, and they're unreasonable. And a perfect way to articulate this is if you go on to Steam, and if you look at the highest achievement, or the most achieved achievement, it is sitting at 15.1%. And I'm looking at my Steam library currently. If we go ahead and take a look at the latest game I did a review for, which is Mount and Blade Bannerlord, the most popular achievement there is all the way up at 49%. If we go ahead and take a look at Total War Shogun, another game within the Total War franchise, the most achievement is at 73.5%. So think about it this way. The most popular achievement inside the entire game is only being achieved by 15% of the people that play this title, and it goes downhill quite drastically from there. There's like 150 achievements in the game. The bottom like 50 are sitting at like less than a 1% achievement rate, and for me, this tells me a couple of things. So first of all, people aren't playing the game for long, right? Because if they were, they'd be getting these achievements. But more importantly, the achievements are also ridiculously niche and just not really achievable, forgive the pun, for most people. So that is a huge issue. Now, we're also going to have to talk about the unit design. So in my opinion, everything just feels too samey. It feels like very similar, right? So I obviously was playing as the Babylonians. I'd be fighting against either, minor factions or some major factions. And a lot of times during battles, I kind of like to zoom in and, see what's going on with my guys on the ground, see if they're fighting, if it's instance combat, if it's just swinging and somebody dies, right? All that sort of good stuff. Total War stuff. You're playing a Total War game. You're controlling little people. It's what you're going to do. When I would zoom in, I would find myself often unable to tell which faction the units were even from. So if you take and if you look at a battle that's happening in this game, and if you turn off the UI, right, so you can't see the highlights of which units are yours, which units are the enemy, and you have the lines crash at each other, you're not going to be able to tell which unit is yours and which unit is the enemy's because they're so goddamn similar, and there's not really anything differentiating them between the different factions. And this is the same thing for minor factions or major factions. Everything just blends together, man. It's so ugh to look at, which is disappointing because the game itself actually looks pretty good. It's a very graphically advanced game, right? Especially by Total War standards, but the units themselves are a big letdown on that front. Now, let's also go ahead and talk about some of the game-breaking bugs. Now, you're not really going to get bugs, in my experience anyways, that prevent you from completing the game, but you'll get bugs that if you don't realize what's happening, you're going to be significantly at a disadvantage. So there is a court system, which is extremely important because it's essentially how you get your assassinations done and all that sort of stuff, like kind of your diplomacy, but in like a slightly different way. And you can get resources from it, and you can recruit, very powerful units through it, all that sort of good stuff, right? So it's super important to your game, right? Simply put, you can get a bug, which again is known. And if you Google it, everybody's talking about it. Creative Assembly, there's no way they don't know this, right? You can get a bug that tells you cannot do a court action while there's an active dilemma. And I looked around the entire, court system screen, and I was like, well, what's the active dilemma? So I ended my turn. I went back to the next turn. You cannot complete a court action while there's an active dilemma. So I looked again. What is this dilemma? There was no dilemma to be found. So I Googled it. I was like, active dilemma, Total War Pharaoh. It's a very common issue where you cannot progress. You have to reload your save in order to actually get the court system back, and this will happen randomly. And if you're just playing the game for the first time, you might think, well, it's crazy. There's dilemmas happening every round. Meanwhile, the AI is abusing the court system, right? It's using the court system still, and you just cannot. So you're just locked out, and you may not even realize it. And it's a prevalent bug that's happened to me at least 10 plus times in my playthrough so far. So it happens a lot. It's insane. The AI is another big issue. It's practically non-existent in battles as well as on the campaign map. So if we go to Shogun 2, which is probably my favorite Total War game, the AI is fantastic. If the AI is defending, they will defend. They won't push you. If the AI is defending and they have high ground, you can be damn sure they're going to be holding that high ground. They're going to have spear units out front, all that sort of good stuff, right? It's very much what you would expect to see from an AI in a strategy game. On the campaign map, they'll make use of, retreats. They'll not really attack you if they're outnumbered. All those sorts of good things. Well, it's not the same inside Total War Pharaoh. So the AI basically always just rushes headlong into combat. They ignore any sort of tactical advantages they may have. So they don't really pay any attention to high ground. They don't pay any attention to, whether they're supposed to be defending or attacking. They simply charge at you head on no matter what. If you've ever played Mountain Blade, it's basically like you're always fighting the bandits because they just charge at you and they have no tactics. Now, this may be different because I didn't do extensive testing on like the hardest difficulties of the game, so it may be different there. But I played through on the normal difficulty, which is what the majority of players, especially first-time players, are going to experience with this title. And the AI was absolutely atrocious. There was no challenge to it. It was simply just battles where who has the better units, right? Like, as simple as that. Now, on the actual campaign map, it's just as bad. So what I found happening a lot is I'd walk an army to a faction, settlement. I'd siege it. They would, get an army that comes over. They would attack me, and I'd be like, okay, I'm outnumbered. I'm going to retreat. And then that army would push up to me. So let's say I had a 20 stack that was attacking this settlement. They came over with their 20 stack, or they came over with a 15 stack, which combined with the defense of the settlement would give them like 30 or, 40 units, right? So I would retreat. Then what would happen is the AI would push their 20 stack towards me, and now they're no longer assisted by the garrison. So, they don't have a 40 stack, a 30 stack, they just have 20 units, and they would attack me again, and now it's this time I can just auto-resolve the battle because they're massively outnumbered and they don't seem to realize it. Things like that just are insanely rudimentary, right? It makes the AI feel very rudimentary. It makes it feel like you're playing against, your younger cousin who it's their first time on a computer. They don't really know what's happening. It's not very fun. Now, we have the return of sticky units, for lack of a better term. So this just absolutely kills tactical depth, and if you're unfamiliar with what I'm referencing, in some of the older Total War titles, you would have essentially a problem where you would charge a unit into an enemy unit, and then you just could not disengage. You would have to sit there and spam click to disengage. Sometimes it just wouldn't even work. And that is a problem, once again, inside Total War Pharaoh. So, for example, cavalry units, if you are charging a cavalry unit at an enemy unit, you are basically saying, hey, I'm okay with this unit dying, charge on anyways, let's see how much damage you can do. Because what happens is, as soon as a cavalry unit is engaged, they don't break off. You can click as much as you want, you can give them whatever orders you want, but they do not disengage. And it's the same thing for infantry. You basically can't disengage from a fight until you've either, been routed or routed the enemy. Simple as that. And you may say, well, that's kind of realistic. If there's an enemy engaging you, you can't really pull off. Well, yes and no. So here's the problem with that. First of all, if you have only infantry, you want to do flanking maneuvers, right? You want to get around behind the enemy, charge into their back, attack them in the flank, route them quicker, right? As you would expect, and as is realistic. But the problem with that now is that since your units cannot disengage, anybody who engages those targets, even from the flank, are now stuck in that combat until everybody's dead, which means that you, yourself, the flanker, can now get charged in the back if the AI has hidden units, or if the AI just has units that manage to flank you, and it's just a never-ending cycle where it's just flanking, charging, stuck in combat. It's crazy. And with cavalry, basically their whole deal in this game now is relegated to just chasing down already broken units and trying to get some extra kills, trying to, thin the numbers and put them into the shattered state so that they don't recover, right? So that their morale doesn't allow them to come back into the battle. It's very disappointing because usually in Total War games, you'd have a hammer and anvil sort of tactic where you'd have your line infantry going at each other, and then you have your cavalry that can circle around, you have other infantry units that can circle around and charge into the backs of the enemies, or charge into the archers. But you cannot do that in this game, because as soon as they make initial contact, they're now locked out of combat, essentially. And it's not just, I could kind of understand it if it was like, oh, you know what? This spear unit, it's stopping my cavalry from leaving. It's very dangerous for them to move around on horses with spearmen around them. Sure, whatever. But archers of the lowest tier, get your cavalry stuck. It doesn't make any sense. These guys have, tiny little knives or clubs in some cases, and your cavalry cannot ride away once they're engaged. It is absolutely insane. And finally, we're going to talk about optimization issues. So I have a 3060 inside my PC, which, granted, it's an older graphics card, but it is still very capable of running almost any modern game. Here's the thing, though, even on the campaign map with medium settings across the board, it maxed it out at 99%, and I didn't even get a full 144 frames to live up to my refresh rate. I would average around 90 to 110. The optimization on this is just absolutely atrocious. Inside the actual battles, I'd be getting anywhere from 80 to 100 frames, right? And it would be maxing out the GPU either way. I tried changing the settings to basically the minimum. I tried changing them to the maximum, and it did not work. So I'm not sure if it's an issue just specifically with my hardware. Not a lot of people were mentioning those sorts of performance-related issues, but I did see a lot of talk about crashes to desktop, obviously the minimization bug that we talked about, and just overall stability issues. This game seems to be plagued by it, no matter what sort of hardware you're on. And of course, when you're in the middle of a battle, if you have a low frame rate and you can't even enjoy what you're looking at, what's the point of looking at it, right? So all that being said, it now brings us to the overall breakdown, so the conclusion, as well as the SWAS rating. So let's go ahead and hop into it. Ladies and gentlemen, after roughly 22 minutes of yapping, we are going to go ahead and break this down. So just to kind of give you the overall conclusion, Total War Pharaoh, in my opinion, is a game with some brilliant new ideas. So obviously the resource management, the laws, the cooperative play, but it's definitely dragged down by some very shocking technical issues for a modern release, as well as shallow systems, specifically when it comes to the combat and the AI. It feels almost more like an experiment as opposed to a polished Total War release. When it was first released, people compared it to a Total War Saga title trying to masquerade as a official Total War title. Now, what they meant by that is the Total War Saga franchise or series is kind of like these smaller, just not as fleshed out experiences, and you still very much have that feeling. So let's go ahead and give it the quick SWAS breakdown. So again, we have story, world, action, sound, and style. I'll just let you know kind of what these are as we go through them. So first of all, for the story, we have a 7 out of 10. So the story in this situation is mainly going to pertain to the actual gameplay through the campaign, since obviously it's a Total War game. You don't have much of a story, so it's unique, though it's certainly not groundbreaking. World is going to be a 6 out of 10, so it's a very interesting premise, but technical and visual issues really just bring it down. So this is going to be things like your visuals, to an extent, a lot of that style as well, but also just your world design, the map design, all that sort of good stuff. So the world is going to be a solid 6 out of 10. Now, we have action, so action is going to score a 3 out of 10. I believe this is the lowest rating I've given to any game out of these metrics so far that I've reviewed. So there's a lot that goes into this, right? So the action in a Total War game is very, very important. We're playing it for the action. We're not playing it for a story. And the AI, the sticky units, and just the lack of depth really cripple the combat, as well as a lot of the actual campaign experience, unfortunately. We have sound. So sound design, I gave a 7 out of 10. Now, the actual combat sounds are pretty decent. The actual soundtrack to the game, which you've been hearing in the background of the video, is also pretty decent as well, but it's not really something that I'll go to bed thinking about. It's not really something that I'll wake up in the morning and I'll be like, hey, you know what? I want to listen to this soundtrack. It's not really something that I can, reference at some point in the future, even inside my own head, which means it's kind of just unremarkable, which gives it a 7 out of 10. Now, finally, the style is going to be another 7 out of 10. So it does have a very attractive presentation. So, it looks good, right? It's a modern game, though the battles themselves do lack a certain level of visual clarity. It's very hard to kind of manipulate the camera sometimes. It feels like you're very zoomed in. A lot of the UI elements are just taking up too much space. It's very to look at, as I mentioned earlier, right? So that's going to bring it to an overall score of 6 out of 10, or 60%, right? What does that mean? Well, I think this title is a fascinating failure in the Total War franchise. Now, if Creative Assembly could fix the bugs and deepen the gameplay, Pharaoh would be something special. But as it stands right now, it feels more like you're troubleshooting a tech demo than it is fun. So, would really like to see some continued updates for this title to kind of help bring it into the modern era. It already, feels like a 10 or a 15-year-old Total War game, even though we're still relatively close to the beginning of this game's lifespan. So would really love to see, again, like I say, some updates or fixes put out for this. Would I recommend it? Not really. If you can get this game on a hell of a sale, perhaps, right? I got this title because I got it through Humble Bundle. It had released on YouTube. I saw it, on Steam. I saw it. I looked at the reviews. I decided at the time not to buy it, even though I was extremely excited about this title. I waited for it to come out. It just happened to come out on Humble Bundle, right? I picked it up. I played through it, and this is where we're at, man. It's not too, let's put it this way. It's a decent Total War game, but I wouldn't recommend playing it first. So if you're new to Total War, go back and play Rome, right? Rome Remastered. Go play Rome 2. Go play Medieval 2, certainly. Go play Shogun 2. You can get these games for massively cheaper amounts of money, especially if there's some sort of a sale. So if you're a new Total War player, go play those first. Experience what this franchise really has to offer. Don't put one of the weakest members in your mouth and then complain that you got bad taste after. Go play those. If you're a returning Total War player, if you already have the other titles, I would recommend to pick this title up to complete your collection, with the massive caveat to do it only if it's on a massive discount during like a Christmas sale or a Steam sale of some sort, or of course if you picked it up on Humble Bundle, or if you can get it as any other sort of a game bundle. Those would be the only times I'd recommend picking it up. Full price game, definitely not worth it. That being said, though, ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching to the end. Make sure to go ahead and subscribe. Hit that like button if you enjoyed the content. There is also a Discord channel linked down below, so if you want to hop in there and talk about games, strategy games, what you think I should review next, if there's something I missed with the review, or if you think I was just unfair, go ahead, hop in there, and let me know about it. Would love to hear it. Thank you guys all so much for watching. I'll see you next time.